guys, welcome back to the Insights Lab podcast. For today's episode, we're going to be looking into the hottest commodities of 2023 and giving you some perspective on what to expect moving forward. Commodities are really volatile at the moment. There's been a lot of changes in terms of policy, and we wanted to break down some of the things that we find most interesting and hopefully bring some insights and potential trade ideas moving forward. Mark, what are your thoughts and what are some of the commodities that you're looking at the moment, and what are you finding most interesting within that space?
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I think preparing for this podcast, I was looking at what I considered to be like some of the most valuable resources, and I came across this term, critical minerals. So it's basically metals, minerals, things that are very important in some of the technologies that we're using in the current day and age, such as with semiconductors, electric vehicles, AI, chips, and all that sort of stuff. So the first one that comes to mind is, everything related to the semiconductors. You're talking about this concept of full conductors versus semiconductors.
The superconductors.
I will always get this one wrong.
No, that's all right. That's all right. They'll know what you mean.
But tell us more about this.
Okay, so there's been a recent breakthrough over the last 6 days where they've claimed to have created a superconductor that's going to be able to operate in room temperature. And this is going to be a complete disruption to that space. Yeah. So to give a comparison and to explain what the difference is between a superconductor and a semiconductor is the resistivity, and this is where I get caught up, resistivity. Yeah. So, but essentially what a superconductor, it has zero resistivity.
Yeah.
Fucking.
It's able to resist?
It's not there's no resistivity in superconductors. Which makes it, really, really much more efficient, but also doesn't have any heat. Often superconductors they only are in operation in extremely high temperatures or extremely low temperatures, and having it in room temperature, it's pretty unclear to see how this is going to be playing out, whether they have to kind of reform some of the infrastructure to kind of embed these superconductors. The thing that's super interesting about this superconductor,
I like that.
Yeah, that they're coining LK99 is that the elements that you're going to need to create it are really, really abundant. So lead and copper.
Right.
Now with lead, there's an oxidized version of it called lenacite. Lenacite. And that's pretty easy to make. But combined with a different modification of copper and an oxidized version of copper, that's how this material has been found. So I think that's super interesting. I think there's a lot of questions around it, and people are still speculating of whether it's true or not. So there's a lot of studies going into it, and we'll see how that plays out. But it's pretty early to see the impact it's going to have or the application or what this actually means. But it's definitely good to start off and inform people that maybe haven't heard of LK99 to look it up and make your own assessments. It's too early for me to even speculate on, but it's a good story and hopefully it's got you hooked.
Well, it's a potential game changer.
Yeah.
And like you said, you've got these scientists or you've got these people who've figured it out in South Korea.
Yeah. And
just because the South Koreans figured it out, you were saying that it doesn't necessarily put South Korea in a massive, advantageous situation. Maybe like first movers, maybe they figured out and they're able to work with it quicker. But chances are other countries will catch on and the advantage will become, less prominent.
Well, who's going to get the most lead or who's going to create the most lenacite quickly? I think that it kind of goes into theme with the tech war that we're seeing at the moment, or the race for AI, the race for resources, and everyone's stockpiling and localizing their own supply chains. I think it'll be the same thing. If this does turn out to be valid and truthful, then I think that lead's going to be back in contention. I think that people are going to try and make as much lenacite as they potentially can. But I think that the major producers of lead are going to be beneficial because I think that people are going to be in a hurry to get in bulk as opposed to kind of worrying about, getting more lead explorers or, trying to get some of these developed mines into production. I think they just want to buy it outright.
So, if you were South Korean and you're head of this party, would you be out there looking for partnerships for, with these producers? Would that be the strategic move? And then also down the line looking at like the countries and like the explorers?
Yeah, I think that if you're in the semiconductor race and your goal is to win that race, I think that you would want to be earlier on and you would want to be paying attention to any breakthroughs in that conductor space anyway. I mean, we're seeing US and China go back to, head to head over Taiwan, over the semiconductors, and, some aggressive policies around it. We talked about germanium and gallium in one of our latest episodes.
Yeah.
Where, although it's not that significant because, the total market for the US for gallium and germanium is only 300 million. Those elements do play a role in the next generation semiconductors because they're more absorbent. And, by halting that, exports from China, which, they are responsible for 94% of the global export of these commodities, it kind of puts a little bit of a dent in the US's capacity to move forward.
So if the US are importing semiconductors from Taiwan, from China, right, and we're talking about the trend of moving supply chain and, more emphasis on localization,
yep.
Then where does that leave, gallium, is it gallium and germanium and gallium? Where does it leave that? Does that make it less valuable potentially and something that's just used by the Chinese rather than, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's just going to allow them to enhance their chips. I mean, we spoke about, most of the semiconductors and the chips that are out there are still silicon based, but that was starting to get phased out. And the term, gallium nitrate, gallium nitrate diodes was starting to take hold, and that market was really kind of starting to grow as well.
Right. And
so,
and I guess like just spelling that out, like that's found in a lot of consumer products like wall chargers and a lot of the adapters that come with like electronics.
Yep.
And that was starting to pick up. They're more efficient. They charge things a little bit quicker. They come in smaller form factors. So there's a lot of benefits from it. But based on where things are going at a global scale, we're probably going to see a few of those products most likely.
Yeah, absolutely. But it really shows the narrative of aggressive policies and the will to outcompete, other nations. China's already announced that they want to be the world's leader in AI by 2030, and so does the US. So be interesting to see. One of the things that we spoke about that I found really interesting was antimony.
Yeah.
And that's another critical metal and a critical resource. It's, and what was the CMI, was it? What was the thing that you mentioned to me before, that critical metals list?
Yeah, so there was the, what was it? The critical minerals Institute. So they identified 14 critical elements that are going to be essential across various industries, including battery materials, electric vehicles, green technologies, and energy production. And from that list, I'll just rattle off the ones that are probably most common. So you've got cobalt, graphite, lithium, magnesium, niobium. But one I probably want to double tap on is antimony, something that you mentioned. And it's the first time I'd heard of it before you brought it up. I think it's a fire retardant, or like is it found in like iPhones and
absolutely, like battery casing. I've heard, I'm not too sure if this is true, but I read somewhere that it's used in children's clothing in the US to make it fireproof. Which makes a lot of sense. The difference between antimony and gallium and germanium is definitely the market. So the US, I think it's like around $300 billion is spent on antimony supply. US is really dependent on other nations, including China, Russia, and I can't even pronounce this one.
Subakistan.
Yeah, Uzbekistan or something.
Starting with a T.
It's starting with a T, and yeah, it's one of the stans. Just look it up. But essentially, with between those three nations, Russia, China, and good old Uzbekistan, that holds 88% of the total global market for antimony, which is really interesting because the US stopped producing antimony in 2001, I believe.
Yeah.
And they're very, very dependent. Canada and North America is responsible, like they do have production of antimony themselves, but that only equates to 7,000 tons a year, as opposed to China's 145,000 tons a year. And I think that if they were to put any sanctions or restrictions on antimony exports, that's going to really change things up. I think it's and I think didn't you say with the Critical Metals Institute, it's a matter of national emergency,
national security.
Yeah. And that's super interesting. So the US does recognize the importance of these critical metals. I'm under the assumption that it's just like if it is a matter of national security, alternatives might not be available.
Yeah.
And they don't. China, Russia, and this other place, I'm not going to announce it again, they don't seem to be the greatest trade partners with the US. I mean, we've already seen with Russia, Ukraine, China tensions with this tech war. This is a significant monopolized market for antimony, and I think that it's kind of going under the radar a little bit. It's something that I hadn't heard about too much, but when I found out about gallium and germanium, I thought, okay, well, this is on here. Who's going to win the tech war? And I think antimony gives China a lot of leverage, considering that's a 300 billion market as opposed to a 300 million.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the other thing that I read about it here, I've got notes mentioning that it's also important in the defense sector.
Yep.
So it's actually used for military clothing, tanks as well. So it's not just tech devices. It's not just like technologies and like green energy production. It's actually used in the defense force. So I think that's probably another big consideration too. So definitely one to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And as you said, if there's so few players that hold such a large percentage of a mineral, it's probably something worth paying attention to if it's also being used. It already has a use case too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's switch gears.
Okay.
I know we've been talking a lot about nuclear power.
Yep.
And specifically uranium. So if we look back to history, or really like it's only in the last 5-10 years that people have started talking about uranium again. For a long time, it's just one of those things that has been in the bottom drawer. People haven't really spoken about. And, like when we think about it, we think about the, catastrophes like Chernobyl and all of the nuclear, like all the issues that come with nuclear, the safety risks really.
Yep. And
I feel like it takes 25, 30 years for people to forget these disasters and to give things a chance again. Can you sort of paint the picture of like what's actually happened in the last 5-10 years? Like how has it performed recently as a resource?
Well, this year it's up about 40%.
Yeah,
Year and year, it's up 40%. The perception of uranium is changing. So there would seem to be a hit piece on uranium after these, tragic events. And a lot of people really didn't look at uranium as being a clean source of energy or just didn't even think that it could be a clean source of energy. It had this kind of stigma to it. And I think that that's really started to change over time. I mean, we're talking about going carbon neutral, and the European Union saying they're going to go carbon neutral by 2035, I think it was. This is a really strong, and it's a source of clean energy. And I think that it's, holding its weight. I think that it's going to continue to perform and continue to be important. I remember when it came to my radar I found out that Sprott Investments in the US, I think it was $1 billion contract for physical uranium. And that was really the catalyst that got my attention to it. I mean, that's a bold move, and they're not messing
massive.
around. And I was just like, their thesis seemed to make a lot of sense. Not long after that, then you had the Australian, France, and the US deal for their nuclear submarines, which caused a lot of political tension with China.
Sure.
But things are starting to shape up. And, just recently I heard a fact with the UAE, that they actually 25% of their energy comes from nuclear power, which is quite staggering because considering they're so rich on gasoline, fuels, and whatnot, for 25% of their energy to make up just nuclear, just seemed to be really, just very, very interesting, really.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like with nuclear disasters, you've got like Chernobyl, that was 1986, and you've got Fukushima, and with these reactors having these massive disasters, the big issue with them is when there is one of these disasters, the potential for radioactive poisoning and stuff like lingers on for many, many years after, right?
Yep.
And I always find that interesting. There's plenty of like documentaries out there that go into the disaster and breaks it down, and with the whole being situated in like Ukraine, Russia, and the recent invasion, that makes it even more interesting.
Yep.
And then you've got like countries that have, made a huge stance against nuclear. Like for example, Germany have just closed their last three reactors. So they've closed the last door. They've shut the door on nuclear energy, and for a long time they were very anti-nuclear, and that's like a door that's going to be very difficult to open up again.
Yep.
So we're seeing it come back into fashion, and I guess what's changed is they're moving from these huge reactors to something called small modular reactors. So these are safer, they're simpler, and they're a cheaper option for nuclear energy, and it makes the power source more attractive as the countries look to achieve energy independence. And as you said, it's considered a clean energy source. So I'm really excited to see where this goes. I know there's a lot of people that aren't on board yet, but we are seeing more and more conversation around nuclear power and uranium.
Yeah, absolutely. Stigma is starting to fade out. So, and it's good that Germany's, taking action. I don't know, if it's shutting down the 3 nuclear power plants, but it's good that they're kind of replacing it with more modular plants, and they're taking it focus, because they made a huge mistake when they went totally renewable. Because renewables is an intermittent sort of source of energy, and without the right storage systems, too much renewables becomes a problem. And I think that Germany was the first one to really get stuck into that and adopt renewables. But I think that they had they made the mistake of not actually having the infrastructure and the storage for that to be able to be contributing to the grid.
Yeah. So now they're back to fossil fuels.
Back to square one. Yeah.
I think like talking about Germany, talking about some of these other places. Who do you think are the main players for uranium? Like I know UAE and Saudi Arabia and South Korea comes up a lot. What can you tell me about Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates and their role in nuclear?
Other than they, have a massive, 25% of their energy comes from nuclear. Yeah. Outside of that, I'm really not too sure of their stance or who the major players are, but I do know India is a really, really big one to watch.
Right, and I imagine they would be exporting uranium too.
Yeah, let me just have a look as we're going into this, because I want to learn about. I want to see who the biggest producers of uranium is.
So I've got a slide here that says that that both the United Arab Emirates and the Republic of Korea have held multiple meetings now, and they've had high-level consultation on nuclear cooperation in Seoul. So you're seeing both of these parties committing to expanding their strategic cooperation and working together on nuclear energy. So I think it's an interesting alliance or partnership because you don't really see like Saudi Arabia and like work with South Korea like that often.
Yeah, interesting trade agreement.
Yeah, and I think you'll start to see China potentially work with Saudi Arabia. You'll see some of these, Brazil and emerging countries work with Saudi Arabia where there's like a common benefit. But, historically, that probably wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I just had a look now. Kazakhstan is the biggest uranium producer in the world.
Really?
Yeah, I know. 21,227 metric tons was produced in 2022.
Yeah, that's massive.
Wow, yeah, and for Canada, followed by Canada, with 7,351 metric tons. So that's a huge difference. But yeah, Canada, I know. And then
What do you think that is as a percentage? Does it sort of say like if it's like a third or like a quarter or?
yeah, it's about a third. Canada's producing about a third of what Kazakhstan does.
Yeah.
So that's going to be really interesting. That's super interesting. I mean, some of the other big players, I mean, Australia, I know that we've got a few uranium companies that we've been looking at throughout the year that have performed quite well. Niger,
Yeah.
which is interesting. I just saw something on social media talking about they need military backing, and there's been some little bit of warfare happening in the region. So that's interesting to see on the list.
What are your thoughts on this? So like, let's say if you've never really considered investing in uranium before and you do your research and you find it to be an interesting investment and you believe in the thesis,
Yeah.
would you be looking at individual companies or would you be looking at the ETF? Like personally for me, I wouldn't know which companies would be like the leading companies. So I'd probably just buy like some sort of ETF which covers most of the main ones. But I'm interested to know if you wanted to get exposure, how you would go about it.
I would be looking at the existing producers. I think that getting into any mining company at the moment in an exploration phase is super risky. I think they're facing challenges they hadn't faced before. Volatility in commodities, price hikes, the term, reverse globalization and localizing supply chains and, export restrictions and whatnot. I think it just makes it super hard. I think that, for a company that's in exploration phase to get into production, they're really heavily dependent not on just the resource, but, is this going to be economically viable? And I think that with the volatility that we're seeing, it's going to be pretty hard. I mean, you could do the economic feasibility study, but that could be a completely different story going forward 2 years, closer to production. So I think that that's going to be something I'm staying away from. But I'd be interested in getting into some of the market leaders. Happens to be, in Kazakhstan, which I won't have access to. Might have to reach out to the Kazakhstanians and make some friends in that area. But the North American market is where I'd be looking. But an ETF, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of where I would start off. But I think that if you find a company and you're pretty good at fundamental analysis and breaking things down, it requires more time. But I think that buying a uranium ETF at the moment wouldn't be a bad option.
And then there's also, sort of following leaders who are advocates for the change early.
Yep.
So there will be people on Twitter, there'll be people on YouTube who catch these movements early. And when something has been out of fashion for some time and it starts to gain momentum, if you are able to recognize who the early participants and advocates for this change and recognizing the momentum early, they're probably ones that are worth a follow and paying attention to seeing what else they have views on, because it's easy to join on a bandwagon when a trend is matured and really in motion.
Yeah.
But it's hard to put your neck out and say, I think it's time for uranium when everyone's like, are you sure? Like uranium, like now? Sort of thing. So
I think that Sprott Investments is that's the one that kind of brought me to the market, that $1 billion contract for uranium.
Yeah.
And then, you've got other players kind of like in North America, there's a mining heavyweight called Rick Rule. He'd be an interesting follow and to see his views on uranium. I think that, but also one that I came across recently was something called Doomberg, and it's a group of people that not hide behind, but they like
anonymous,
yeah,
or?
they're anonymous,
Right.
right? And they're kind of represented by this green animated chicken. Yeah, but they were early adopters, and they have a pretty strong view on uranium's market and clean energy, using that as a clean energy source.
Yeah.
And I would encourage the audience to kind of follow these people and to see their views. I think they break it down, but they've made a lot of money from it. I mean, Doomberg made a lot of money from this uranium move at the start of COVID.
Yeah.
So he was a lot earlier than I was, but yeah, definitely by paying attention, it's kind of helped me with my own investment summary in some of these companies, using some of their or adopting some of the ways that they're thinking about things.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. Like, I really like Twitter. You get to see multiple perspectives from multiple people on and their hot takes in real time, compared to what often becomes like a news article which has a certain spin on it, or like an agenda, and often it comes out when it's already like common knowledge. So sometimes Twitter gives you a hot take on something early,
Yeah.
and that can be your your edge. So finding it's like seeking out and finding these people who are first movers, and then also just paying close attention to some of their takes, and then trying to understand what is their take, what are their arguments, and then trying to find the counter argument, so you make sure you're not just going in with rosy-eyed glasses.
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw the same thing with lithium. I mean, that's been a common, that's been in contention for the last few years, with the electric vehicle movement and whatnot, and renewable energy. But, that's down 15% year to date, I think it is. And, we've got, even though the demand forecasts are through the roof, we're not too sure if we can actually meet that demand, because we're going to need a lot more lithium producers moving forward. So sometimes, these things are continuously changing over time, but I can't see uranium and the move, and the importance of uranium. I think that's a trend that's going to be long lasting.
Let's talk about that for a second. So when you say lithium is down 15%, you're talking about the commodity price?
Yeah.
So
Lithium carbonate spot price.
So that's interesting, right? Because if you think about it, commodity prices can have a pretty significant impact on the global economy and like the various industries, because it dictates whether it's going to be profitable for the manufacturers, the end producers, right, of these industries, and like ultimately it will determine, say, the Teslas of the world, whether their pricing strategy is going to be higher, lower. They need to factor the cost of the commodities in, but then they need to factor in inflation and all of the other macro factors too. But it does play a part in supply, and it does play a part in ultimately demand, because off the back of the prices of the products that are being and services being sold.
There's one more thing that I wanted to mention, and this is actually something that you brought up to me before that I found super fascinating, and it kind of changed the way that I thought about commodities itself.
Yeah.
You said something to me before about data. Looking at, when we think of commodities, we think of raw materials. Like, well, that's what I think of straight away. But when you said, data is a pretty hot commodity at the moment with these, the advancement of artificial intelligence. Can you elaborate? Talk to me what you were telling me before, if you can.
yeah. Like, let me try to remember. Like, to your point, commodities are often seen as like tangibles, things that you can hold, touch, feel, and often we don't think about data as a commodity until, like you pointed out, and it sounds really obvious.
Yep.
But it's like what we're seeing right now is ChatGPT. We're seeing data sets being refined, and we've got this service that's amazing, and we're training it. But really, it's collecting data. It's understanding how people like interact with the AI system. So we're training it while it's helping us, and we've got all these vehicles on the road, these Teslas, which are designed to be driverless at some point, and they're collecting data on the roads, which will ultimately feed back to Tesla, and Tesla can use that information. And we see the same thing through social media. We see the same thing through bricks and mortar businesses, where they collect data through loyalty rewards, and they understand consumer behavior. And then off the back of that, there'll be policies, there'll be marketing strategies, marketing plans, and a lot of that will be impacted based on the data. And that data can really help understand what people are going to do before they do it, and where the economy is going and what the future is going to look like in many ways.
Absolutely. It's absolutely fascinating. I want to ask you a question, just get your thoughts on it. We see aggressive policy and restrictions and sanctions on commodity exports. Do you see any sanctions or restrictions or around data? You know, big companies or big marketing companies that are, you know, like on a national basis. Do you see them withholding a lot of their information, or placing a lot more importance in keeping that safe due to the nature of international competitiveness or international trade?
Yeah, certainly. Like with any technologies that have a potential to change our day-to-day lives, and you know, with that comes like risk for people. You'll see regulation happen, but I don't think it'll be at a global level. It's probably going to be more at a national level, and then again at like a state level. So we've already seen this when we look at AI, and we see that each country recognizes the implications of AI and its recent developments, but each country has taken its own stance. Some just blanket, like, no, we're not going to we're not going to condone like ChatGPT or whatever it is in our country at all. It's going to be banned in the entire country, and there'll be like censorship and restrictions and that sort of thing. And then there'll be other countries that will embrace it. But ultimately, it's probably not about completely shutting something down, but it's also not like just allowing like no regulation and policy, and just sort of seeing it play out. So I think we do need regulation, and we do need like policy, but it's probably going to be managed at like a national level, and then like also at like a personal level, right? Like you, in the same way that parents now have to decide whether they let their kids use their iPads and social media, and if there's like restrictions, and like you got parental privacy options and stuff on the devices. I think there's going to be like the leading companies in these spaces, like Apple, for example, will give you some flexibility in terms of like what you can control, but for the most part, they're trying to collect your data, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, that's absolutely fascinating. Hopefully the audience has got a lot out of today's podcast. So we talked about antimony, LK99, which is the recent development for the superconductors, uranium, touched a little bit on lithium, and just the general assumptions associated with commodities, and data is a massive one. It's a strong point, and it's, you know, in contention now with the race for AGI.
We'll leave some of the resources like Doomberg and Rick Raw and some of the other people that are leading in this space, so you guys can check them out. But otherwise, it's been great to have you guys on this episode, and we look forward to catching you guys on the next one. Thanks.